All right. I am super excited to be talking to this amazing powerhouse attorney today, who I have known for a few years now. Even before my time started at AttorneySync, was kind of in the orbit of my family and friends. And so just really excited to be talking to Erin Gerstenzang today, an Atlanta-based criminal defense attorney. So hello, Erin. Welcome to Clienting.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. So we're going to be talking today about how to build out your law firm and your lawyering practice with public speaking. But before we get into that, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am an attorney, as you might imagine. I practice criminal defense in Atlanta, Georgia, and I represent people who are charged with alcohol and drug-related offenses. So I did a ton of DUI the first decade of practicing, a ton of DUI defense, which has really grown into tackling some of those larger issues, so felony and misdemeanor offenses under that umbrella.
Fabulous. And I just have to encourage anybody who is listening to this to also check out the video, because where Erin is sitting in this beautiful office that she gets with this lovely view, I'm so jealous by the greenery that is surrounding her.
Yes, Atlanta is a beautiful city and I love to rep my city. My office is amazingly on the Beltline in Atlanta. So that is the background. And we are at Pond City Market for anybody who's local, which is a really fun place to be.
Fabulous. So one of the first things, this kind of just popped into my head earlier today. I was thinking about this sort of future focus that you have and kind of looking into what's kind of happening in the distance with law. So you're a criminal defense attorney, managing, DUI, that sort of thing. And there is the automation that is coming into play with cars and things. And so is that something that that has kind of shaped how you're looking at your law practice for the future?
Yeah, I think, so because I do DUI defense, ever since I started 15 years ago, we've all been watching for autonomous vehicles and seeing how that's going to affect our practice. We've any DUI attorney has been keenly watching that for the last 20 years. What's surprising though is the real disruption has come in not from automated vehicles where we were all anticipating it, but really it's come in from Lyft and Uber, which has been this amazing societal fix that has really solved a problem that, we have been treating as a crime and punishment problem, but really is more of has deeper and different sources of this problem, mainly addiction and also having alternative transportation. So it's cool to see that disruption. But as a DUI attorney, it's important, and I think any attorneys, that we always be on the lookout for, hey, any kind of technology outside influences and internally influences coming from the legal profession and pushing out can impact our practice. So we want to be able to sort of move and transition in that way. So it's an exciting time to be a DUI attorney, but it's also, a time to be open to looking for other ways to help people solve problems that we as lawyers and trial lawyers are uniquely situated to do.
Yeah. Awesome. And so one of the things that I see you doing to help kind of solve problems is just a little bit different, and that's helping lawyers solve their problems with your public speaking.
Yeah.
And so what are the things that you're doing for public speaking?
So I love public speaking, and I was on a stage talking to a national audience as a lawyer before I'd even done a trial. So that's always been a big part of my practice. And I started out as a speaker talking more about really niche sort of topics that help DUI attorneys. So cross-examination or blood testing or the science behind breath testing or closing arguments. So that was what I spent, that was how I learned to be a public speaker, was focusing on a lot of those topics. But I realized probably about now almost a decade ago that there are all these other ways that you can help lawyers from a stage and engage in this public speaking and go to communities where I wasn't as well known. So I started focusing on legal ethics was where I started focusing on, and that got me in front of different kinds of lawyers, which is great because you should always be trying to go where you're rare and not just talk to a room full of people who do exactly what you do. So that sort of took off, and I have been speaking nationally for quite a while now, for, as I said, almost a decade. And I talk about legal technology, which was something I had to adopt in my own practice when I went solo. I talk about design thinking for lawyers. I love lately talking a lot about bias in the workplace. So how that in particular affects women and how women can be better mentors to other women, but also focusing on diversity. And I get to talk to a lot of New York lawyers where there's a diversity requirement now for their CLE, and they don't have a lot of good content. So I get to be flown up there and go talk to them about, you know, issues that really I'm very passionate about. And I've always been passionate about blood testing and criminal justice, but the nice thing is I'll get to sort of broaden my reach and touch on topics that deeply are very important to me and help me sort of move the needle and make the world a better place beyond just helping trial attorneys be better trial attorneys.
Yes. And so you're doing all this public speaking and all these different topics. How is the public speaking you're doing affecting your actual practice in your law firm?
So that's a good question and something I've been thinking about. I should give you some background and some context. I don't think you know this about me, Kelly, but
I don't.
You do know that I have a lot of lawyers in my family.
Yes.
And both my parents are criminal defense attorneys. And although I love talking about sort of the futures now and what law firms of the future should be doing, public speaking is a very old school way of building your reputation. And it's one I grew up watching my father do. He never advertised. And he has a wildly successful practice to this day in New York. And he's the top DUI attorney in New York. And one of the ways that he built his reputation was by public speaking. And so he has taught every single state trooper in New York about how to investigate a DUI. He teaches judges and he teaches lawyers. And so they all have his book. They all know him. And what he found, you know, pre-internet, how do you develop that kind of reputation? And you develop that reputation by being helpful and teaching people to do what they have to do and to do it better. And you will be an instant hero to those people. And so now if you ask any judge or any police officer or any lawyer in New York who to reach out to, 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you Peter Gerstenzang. So I grew up watching how critical this kind of ability and skill is to building a practice, and how you know it's so much more helpful to teach people. They will remember you forever and always say kind things about you forever. That's so much more helpful than you know, running an advertisement or, you know, being on the radio. So I think it's an old school method that still works to this day, and it has been very valuable for my practice. You know, being able to be interesting and helpful on stage, even at a young age where I was doing a ton of DUI, but you know, if you're not in the courtroom with me, you don't know if I'm good or not. And so building that reputation, I found when I started speaking, even just in Georgia, all of a sudden people would stop me in court and say, oh, you know, I was in that presentation and that was so great, and let me talk to you. Or I would go to a county where I didn't know anybody, and I didn't know the judge, and I didn't know the prosecutors, and you know, you'll get pushed around or you'll get ignored. But then I would have a public defender come up to me and say, oh, you spoke, here, let me tell you, let me help you out. So it's been really this virtuous cycle from the very beginning of having, being able to build a reputation where people don't usually get to see what you do. Your victories aren't super public. But when you help them from stage and you help them build a better practice and be better at what they do, it's always funny, even to this day, how surprised I am, but you know, excited that all of that work has paid off and people found it valuable and want to help me in return.
Yeah. So it's kind of like building out a super powerful referral network, essentially. So you're, when you go to a networking event, you're in front of like 4 or 5 people, and it's really, you know, it's just kind of like, oh, hey, you know, meet you, maybe 25 or 50 people. But when you're on stage, potentially, like when you presented at Clio, you presented to a packed house of what, like upwards of hundreds of lawyers who now have your name in their ear, and they're thinking like, okay, all right, so Erin Gerstenzang, I'm in Atlanta, or know somebody that's there and gets into trouble with any of these things, or she can even refer to another lawyer and just kind of create that cycle.
Right. It's great to be that contact person and to be the person that they think of as representing Georgia when you think about a criminal offense. So that is very valuable, and it helps build your reputation. I think, I'm trying to think, did I get referrals out of CLEO? Strangely, I usually get referrals for my DUI practice if I'm at a DUI event, and then they refer me because they will be the ones who get those calls. But it is very helpful even to local attorneys. If you're the person who's selected to be on stage, then that's just a great place to build your reputation, and it opens a lot more doors for you.
Yeah. How are you, speaking of, talking to your DUI audience and versus other audiences, how are you choosing the events that you're speaking at? Is there certain criteria that you look for?
Well, let me just say that for the first, it's only recently that I've been lucky enough to be able to be selective about the places where I say yes. Because for the first, it takes a really long time to get, or for me, it took a really long time to be comfortable and interesting and build that reputation and get on people's radar where they realize that there might be valuable content here. So I don't now. I look for topics that are universally helpful. Like I will do a lot in Georgia for free, for the organizations that, these are my people. So criminal defense attorneys, I will do a lot of the stuff that comes my way that is easy for me to get to and isn't going to disrupt, my whole week. So I can just pop in and do it. But then when it comes to out-of-state issues, 5 years ago, I was talking about the blood testing equipment in Wyoming and whether or not it was forensically viable. That's a real niche assignment to learn about the blood testing in Wyoming and learn about their lab and learn about their challenges. So that's an opportunity that may be less appealing to me these days because that's not something that I can repeat and be helpful to a larger audience. So now I do try to look for topics that are universally helpful to people. So that's technology. Legal ethics was my sort of in for that. And I realized, looking for these opportunities where there's not good content too, because that's the other problem. I have, been to enough CLEs, as we all have, to know that a lot of the content's not very good. It's not, it's a volunteer workforce. It's a lot of lawyers who are putting the presentations together the night beforehand. And so for legal ethics, for instance, there was really nothing interesting on the map in 2012 when I started talking about it. There weren't a lot of places beyond getting, some very mature judge to say, don't lie, steal, or cheat, and that was essentially every single ethics presentation that every lawyer had been to. So finding a place where you can offer valuable and useful and interesting content, and what I started talking about was social media and legal ethics, and just identifying all these issues that lawyers were getting into trouble for. And that was really powerful because lawyers don't have another source for that kind of information. We don't have time to really research it. So it was, people were on the edge of their seats. It was great content. They were so excited about it, but also terrified by it. And so people, lawyers would say, I've deleted my whole Facebook account in the middle of your presentation. It's like, don't do that. But, it was really interesting to see how just being a little bit creative and thinking outside the box, really CLEs are so boring and often not even helpful. It'd be fine if they were boring and helpful, but they're often neither. They're both boring and not helpful. And so that's where I think that people get stuck and speakers get stuck, because if you don't speak very frequently and you get on stage and you think I'm supposed to sound smart, I need to say the smartest thing. And you're sort of, I find that one of the rookie mistakes people make at CLEs is they are trying to speak to the smartest person in the room as opposed to speaking to the lowest common denominator. And because that's where most people are. And so the focus should be, hey, teach them a few useful things and package it in an interesting way. And you will be the best rated speaker, and they will remember what you've taught them for years, as opposed to trying to pack in a ton of dense content that you think the smartest person in the room may appreciate, but even the smartest person in the room is going to be bored to tears by. Strategically, you want to make sure that you're getting topics and it's not just the topic you get. Legal ethics is probably one of the most boring topics you can get assigned. There's always interesting ways to talk about whatever it is that you've been assigned. And when you're just starting out, like now some of my friends will say, hey, Erin, what do you want to talk about? But, again, that's relatively recent that I get to pick what I get to talk about. Usually I was being assigned, some crazy like drug courts, some kind of crazy thing that they just had a slot on their agenda to fill. And I, just got creative and did as I was asked.
Yeah. And one other thing that I find that a lot of speakers miss is the action items too, is like, make sure that you're having your, whatever it is that you're teaching, that they can come away and put something into action,
right.
Whether it's, the new way they present a case, the new, legal ethics tips they can get away with. For us, it's like, what marketing tips can people actually go back and do?
Right.
But just all of that, like you've got to give something to people that they can that will actually make a difference in what they're doing every day.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's, and that's hard. That's more difficult than you may think, because it's not as simple as just saying, give them something to do, because I do, for me, in my context, in the, when I'm talking about trial techniques, I try to think of it as, what can they go in on Monday and use and implement on Monday in court? How can they make this happen and make this a reality? Much of what we hear in CLEs is, this is what an amazing attorney who had far more resources and far more training than you could accomplish. And it's like, well, that is useless to the majority of the people in the room. But the real place for speakers to shine is, if you are good at knowing how you do things, then you can teach it. And one of the problems that I see with a lot of, and I'm biased because I see a lot of trial lawyers, so let me just side note, when I go to events, I grew up at CLEs being taught by trial attorneys. So I never realized the disparity. I never realized people presented sitting down. I mean, that's like a total, when I went to ABA Tech Show, I was like, you can't be interesting sitting down. What is happening? It makes the audience crazy to sit. I went to a conference this weekend and they're like, thank you so much for standing, like, oh my God. And that's something that, if you're not a professional, if you're a professional presenter, I'm sure that there's going to be a couple of people who are professional presenters and might disagree with me. And I've seen Baron Henley speak sitting once, and he of course was very captivating because he's Baron Henley, but nobody else can get away with that. So don't sit. People find it as a security blanket. So trial attorneys, though, are great presenters, and I didn't realize till I started going to some of these tech shows that, whoa, the bar is disparate, I will say. People don't all come with the same strengths, and so I, for the first time, saw that this was a real, there were just some basic presenting skills that trial attorneys had a leg up on, because that's just what we have to do, that not all attorneys have to do. And so it's just something to keep in mind. Rule number one, always stand. Even if it makes you more nervous, you're going to be better, and it's easier to listen to you if you are standing. So
yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
What would
we got
No,
off.
I love that. I love that. What would rule number 2 be?
I have a couple of rules. Okay, rule number 2, slides, less is more. I have the distinct advantage. I have a bunch of like secret weapons. One of them, when it comes to slide work, is my husband, who is not a lawyer, and he does future stuff, but he builds, $100,000 or more decks for big CEOs. So I've learned a lot from him and watching his work go by, how to build a good slide. And how to use a slide effectively. So the number one mistake that lawyers make for slides is they're, again, trying to speak to the smartest person in the room, and they cram a slide full of content. And there should never be much more than a sentence of content on your slide. So first of all, never put anything on your slide that you're not willing to read out loud. So that is one of the most frustrating things as an audience member, is lawyers love to pack the slide with dense content and say, well, in here you can obviously see. And the problem is, people can't listen and read at the same time, and they don't want to. And it's so stressful when you ask your audience to do that. Like, you will just get, and this is the face, the like disconcerted face that they make, that is unnerving to see as a speaker, but that is the face you're going to get when you're throwing content up, and it's not important enough for you to actually take a moment and read aloud. So that was one of my unlocks, that I realized I need to read any content I have on the slide out loud. And if it's not worth reading out loud, take it off your slide. And if it's more than a sentence, you need to really be sure that whatever's up there is critical to your talk.
What about, I've seen a lot of presentations where they'll put images up or they'll put things up where if you go back and look at the slides later, it makes absolutely zero sense. And so you kind of need to be there for the presentation. So how does someone bridge that gap of not putting the content up there and then also having, so many conferences these days will give you the slide decks. And so you get the slide deck and then you're like, what happened here? I don't understand why there's a picture of a duck. And so, how do you go between those two things?
I'm so glad you asked this question because this is a personal pet peeve and the world may disagree with me, but I have a microphone for a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to share my honest
Perfect.
It was never the case that I'm aware of that written materials or which, really the practice of sharing slides comes from the practice of sharing written materials. And what we see a lot of lawyers do is replace the written materials because they're hard and boring and annoying to do with their slides. And so you're actually, when you do that, that is probably part of what is happening with the presenters, why they're creating these terrible to look at slides that are not helpful at all in the presentation, but may be helpful later when you go into the written materials and they also act as the written materials. Your slides should never be a replacement for your presentation. If your presentation is your slides, then you don't need to be there and you don't need to present it. So I almost never turn in my slides unless, the person who's invited me and is paying me has asked me to give them to them because I consider the slides to be half of the presentation, which are completely useless if you're not there for the presentation. So I think that that's a really good example of lawyers fundamentally missing the point of what slides are supposed to be. They're not supposed to tell your story. They're supposed to accent or highlight the story. So a lot of my slides will just be images. And it will make beautiful sense, hopefully, when you're in the room. But afterwards, if you're creating slides for somebody to look at afterwards, well, then that's the wrong tool. That shouldn't be something you also have up in your presentation. And also similarly, I get pushback from written materials. People are like, well, you didn't go along the order of your written materials. And I was like, excuse me, written materials are also supplemental, right? Never did I go into a class in college or law school and think, I don't need to be here to listen to the teacher because I got his slides and I did the homework. Those are supplemental, but they're not the content. That's why you're sitting in the room listening to a professor. So I don't think, I think slides should be used to augment the actual in-person experience. And if there's content that you want to deliver to supplement, then that's the written materials. But it's never been the case that if you miss the presentation, you can still get the same value out of it. And to do so, I think would hurt the actual presentation because you'd clutter your slides with, tailoring it for people who aren't even in the room. And those aren't the intended audience. The people in the room are the intended audience.
Oh, I'm so appreciate that. I asked that question 100% selfishly because that's one thing that coming from non-legal before AttorneySync, it wasn't this thing of like where you handed over your deck and you gave it in. Like if you gave a talk, you gave a talk and it was there and you maybe did a handout just like you're talking about, or you did some supplementary material with it. But you didn't just go, okay, here's my slide deck and, that's it. And so, since joining legal adjacent industry, it's like, okay, so now I have to give my slides. And then if I give them my slides, but then they don't make sense, they're not going to get anything and it's going to be confusing. So I really appreciate that perspective. And hopefully maybe some of the legal organizations who have speakers will hear this and go, oh, okay, so we should just record the presentation then and put it up if that's okay with the speaker instead.
Right, or have clear guidelines. We should all have an agreement as to what slides are for and what written materials are for. And that sort of has fallen by the wayside. So there's very rarely, for those of you who don't speak a lot, let me just tell you, there's very rarely a lot of conversation that goes into it. And the written materials are really, in my opinion, I think they're only asked for to satisfy the CLE requirements because many of the people approving the program for CLE need to see the written materials. And so I think that I think the written materials should be valuable. I think speakers should be spending time writing the article or the supplemental piece to their talk, but they don't. And so often that gets discounted, and now it's been so diluted. It's, well, your slides are your written materials.
Yeah. Well, in the handout that you give, or the written material that you give, that's something that is what a person can take with them in the audience and then remember you even more. Because yes, obviously being in front of someone and having that physical presence, like you're going to stick out on their head, but what they actually take back, and especially if you're doing this to kind of build out your referral business for your firm, you want to have your name and your contact information on something that you have given them.
Yeah. And that's probably the most that people are going to rely on your written materials, is to, if they're curious enough to go back and find out who was that person who spoke. It's funny how attorneys will hoard written materials. Like, they'll miss a conference. Oh, can I get those written materials? And they'll hound you. Then they don't read them. Like, very few attorneys out there are ever returning to the written materials and reading them. So it's just, it's hilarious that we go through all of this theater about written materials. And my hope is people do read my written materials, but my expectation is low.
Yeah, I bet for yours they will. You provide some good info.
Oh, well, thank you. I'd like to think so, but no, I don't think, we just don't have time. But yeah.
That's a good point. So one of the other things that you are doing as a speaker that is like, this is how I can tell that you're really attacking this as a part of your business or building out your business, is that you have an actual speaker website. And it is beautiful. I'm going to put the link to it in there, but it's just your name, eringerstanzang.com. And it has the topics that you speak on, videos showing your speaking, testimonials from event coordinators where you've spoken, your schedule, and so much more. Like, it's, it's everything that it's supposed to be for a speaker website.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm so glad that you're maybe the only person who spends any time there. So I appreciate that audit. It actually has grown out of, I kept it on my website. If you're a speaker, if you're just starting to speak, or you're midway through your career, or you're advanced, if you haven't already, make a list of every time you speak. That's one of the most valuable things, that it started out as embedded in my legal website, a list of all of the speaking events that I would never recall to this day, but it's so helpful to have, because once you speak at an event, this is sort of as an aside for lawyers, you want to make sure that you let AVO know that you're speaking to other lawyers, and you want to let super lawyers know that you're speaking to other lawyers, because it is one of the best telltale signs for objectively evaluating whether or not this attorney is good is, are they trusted to teach other lawyers? So having that list is so valuable, because you can go in and fill out those profiles, and it will immediately impact your rating. And it's just something you will never remember if you don't keep the list going. So that's where it started out, as a very long list. And then it sort of grew from there. And it's just, one of those projects that I know we all have a million things to do. So if you just have a regular website you can dedicate a page to, I found it valuable. I also, I didn't expect it to really pull in clients, but I found that it really does. Clients love to read about what other things you're doing, for the same reason super lawyers cares if you're speaking to other lawyers. So do clients, because they have so little information to distinguish us from another person. So that is, it's helpful to have and showcase and be proud of.
Yeah. I talk so much about how video is really important to set yourself apart from other lawyers, to show your personality. And even if it's not a topic that a client is that relates to the case they're going to have with you, at least there's something so they can understand how you present yourself. Because especially for personal injury and criminal defense, when they think it's possible that you'll go to trial, they want to know that you're not just in a suit in a picture on your website, looking tough or looking friendly. They want to know, how are you going to present yourself to a jury? And maybe for a large subset of potential clients for trial attorneys, they wouldn't be doing that deep dive, but there are enough, especially the high level personal injury cases, where they're counting on you for maybe a lot of money in the end, and they want to know that they can trust you to get them to that point.
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing that clients don't always know to look for. And I often see lawyers in court like, what was that person thinking when they hired this lawyer? Like, what didn't they see that we all sort of see? But you know, what I think clients don't think about is personality, and personality matters so much in certain practices. I can't think of any trial practice where personality does not matter. And you can tell so much from just a video of talking to someone what their personality is. Do you like them? Are you going to like working with them? Working with them is the prosecutor. You know, people might think that we're supposed to be, you know, and that's why you see lawyers always so tough, right? Because there's this, and I think it's lawyer driven, this expectation that that's how lawyers should be. But yeah. I will tell you, if I was that sort of person, or that was the person in my practice, I would not get nearly the kinds of deals I get for my clients, because you have to not only be good at what you do, you have to be likable, because that's what gets you across the finish line. You know, if I have a prosecutor who's on the fence, they're going to give me the deal because I'm a nice person, I'm friendly to work with, I'm honest. Hopefully that comes across in videos as well. And so clients, I don't think always know to look for that, but it matters, the personality of the person that you're hiring. This is not a dentist. You know, maybe it doesn't matter what personality a dentist has. Maybe it does. I don't know. Maybe dentists will get very upset by that comment. But for your lawyer, it matters that they're good in court, but also that they're likable. Because if they are unlikable, there are all kinds of ways that secretly your case can be impacted by the judge, by the judge's secretary, by the prosecutor, the opposing party, where they can make your life more miserable merely because they don't like your attorney. And that is so common, but something you won't see unless you're an insider.
Yeah. So speaking of personality, I also think about this as sort of branding. And I know, you know, I care about branding because for me, brand is not just a logo. Brand is not just the colors you choose for your law firm. It is the essence of who you are, who your law firm is, your personality, all of that kind of rolled into one. But I know it kind of gets treated as, or looked at as like a soft part of marketing, or just like, you know, yeah, well, I'm a lawyer, so of course I'm like tough, or I'm going to fight really hard. Do you think that has made a difference for you? Because that's one of the things I'm just going to not bury the lead here. One of the things that I have noticed in looking at your website, your law firm website, as well as your speaker website, is that it has a different look and feel than a lot of other lawyer websites.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to hear you say that. I think that that's something that I was late to the party on a little bit. I spent most of my career, I'm surrounded by lawyers. My sister's a lawyer, my brother's a lawyer, my parents are lawyers, my uncle's a lawyer, everyone's a lawyer.
Yes.
Like many uncles, cousins. But I think even if you have no family members who are lawyers, if you're in the legal profession, somewhere along the line, we all get indoctrinated to have this lawyer think of this is what the public expects a lawyer to be, and like, which is generally like mean, not accessible, and not super fun to hang out with, right? Like when you see these stereotypical images. And so something I was very uncomfortable at first, but been leaning into is, hey, this is what, I don't want clients who want a certain kind of lawyer that don't fit that mold for me, because they're not going to value what I bring to the table, right? They don't want the client service that I bring. Maybe they, you know, only want a bulldog, and they don't want someone who's going to sit there and talk to their teen about addiction, and they don't want to understand the process or be part of the decision making. And you know, those are strengths that I bring to the table, but don't pay my fees if those aren't valuable to you. So I think that the more authentic we can be in our branding, the better. I think as a speaker and as a trial attorney, one of the things I always credit, and this is, you know, when I speak about often women mentoring women, I talk about, you know, a lot of us had male mentors, and some of the best mentorship I had as becoming a trial attorney was we would listen to these great attorneys from across the country, and they would say, you know, this is how I do it, but under no circumstances should you do it the same way unless you have the same personality. Don't go into trial wearing somebody else's skin, because people are human lie detectors, and even if you don't know what the lie is, you will pick up on inauthenticity. And so in order to be compelling and likable, you have to be authentically you. And so I don't think many female attorneys, you know, in their mid to late 20s are told how important it is to be themselves. And I really am grateful that I got that training, because that's true not just in courtroom. I think that's true when helping your clients, being authentically you and really embracing what your strengths are and what you bring to the table, but also being a speaker, because you have to be you on stage. You cannot be the formal version of yourself that you think all lawyers are expecting to see, because you will be boring. Nobody will listen to you, and you won't change any minds. And that's, that's one of the exciting things about being a speaker for me, is changing minds and opening up hearts and creating a new path for people that they maybe never imagined before. And so you can't do any of that if you're that stiff, formal person trying to be what you imagine a lawyer would do in that situation in your head. So authenticity is what will win, whether you're in the courtroom, whether you're dealing with clients and doing branding, or you're speaking. And I think you have to, and I wasn't sure, I think I always heard people say, we're all on the path, we're all discovering ourselves, so not all of us have a really clear idea of what that means, but be curious about it and lean into it, and don't be afraid. Don't try to fit yourself into some lawyer box, because that's not a brand. And that's what you see on all these websites. When you say that mine is different, I hope mine is just authentically me. And really what's different is I no longer look to other people's law websites and think, let me see what I should be doing, because I'm through the looking glass and I realized they don't know what they're doing. They've delegated that, to somebody else. So make those decisions that are very true to yourself. I think Jess Birkin does a great job on her website of talking about her practice and who she is. And I think that's the model you want to follow when discovering your brand is figure out what's really you and what you believe in. And you'll like your practice. Once I did that, we did do a branding sprint. I got a team to help me with the branding sprint. And once it was really helpful, not because they told me what my brand was about, but it allowed me that freedom and thought to do a lot of thought experiments about what I do value, what I offer, and what the clients who I want to attract will also value.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is such great advice. So one of the things we were talking about before we hit record on this, or at least got into, that we noted down to come back to, was talking about speaking and whether or not you should get a coach or you should work with someone who is a professional. And I know, I just actually thought about this, is that I know that there is, Trial Lawyers College, and there are a lot of places you can go to get help with your trial speaking skills, and that people find that valuable, but don't necessarily maybe think about that for outside of the courtroom and when you're on a different kind of stage. How do you look at that? What are you thinking?
So it's funny, speaking has always been, because of, my experience growing up, and I got to see my dad do it. Speaking is something I get a lot of joy out of, and then wanted to get better. I'm always, if you know anything about me, I'm always trying to optimize something, whether it's diet or exercise or stuff or lack of stuff, and I love minimalism. So I wanted to get better at speaking, even though my problems were not, am I afraid of speaking in public? No, I was past that. And, everybody starts where they were. I did start off being terrified and practiced for hours in the mirror to get, to a point where I could stand up without looking terrified. But I really wanted to accelerate beyond that. And I joined the National Speakers Association. I will tell you that my experience wasn't awesome with it. I found it seemed to cater to a lot of either newbies or super experienced people. Many of those experienced people just, swung around me and gave me their card because they wanted to sell coaching to me. So that wasn't as valuable as I had hoped it would be. I spoke to a couple of speaking coaches, somebody who was highly recommended. He wanted to charge me $7,000. I had prior to getting that quote, I had worked with a speaking coach who, it was just a terrible experience, and she didn't give me my money back. I was like, this is not working for me. She didn't give me the money back. And I think that there's something to be said. There's probably the right program. I've yet to come across it and see people really teaching the fundamentals that are helpful. And the good news is, I guess, the best way to get comfortable and good at it is the first thing is you need to get comfortable on the stage. And so that just comes from practice. I don't think you need a coach. Some of the best advice I've gotten is to film every single talk you give. And I sometimes remember and sometimes don't. But, you know, it doesn't matter if it's on a handheld device and you have a family member. My sister will come to a lot of my talks. She's a lawyer and she'll film it, you know, and have somebody take that footage, because you will identify the things that you're doing. It's a really good opportunity to fine tune, especially if you're in that place where you're like, I'm comfortable. I just want to get to the next level. You can self-correct and identify those things. So I will tell you some of my Achilles heels are, I'm a New Yorker and I talk too fast, inevitably. Court reporters are telling me that all over the state of Georgia. I know that I speak fast. So there are, you know, some quick reminders that I try to give myself before I get on stage. I gesticulate a lot. And although there's some great tips, I love, if you guys know, do you know about Creative Live? It's a great online resource for taking awesome classes. It's for a lot of creatives, but there's a lot of public speaking courses. I find those to be far more valuable than the coaching sessions I've had. But Vanessa Van Edwards she has a really cool company. The Science of Bodies, I believe is what it's called. And she talks about how hand gestures are really good. You want to be able to see people, TED Talks that go viral always have the speakers come out and always show their hands, and they're like, I'm going to talk about 3 things today. And one of the reasons that the hands are really important is because there's that lizard part of your brain that, you know, is still operating as if it was 1,000 or more years ago, and is always looking for threats from other people. And so the one way you get that lizard part of your brain to relax is if they can see your hands, you find a person much more trustworthy. And so this is like the universal way to like tell that lizard part of the brain that people aren't even aware is talking, like, hey, I'm not a threat. And much more easy to listen to. I also use that in trial. Ever since I learned that, my clients have to have their hands on the table and always visible at all times to the jurors, because you know, they're trying to pick up on all of those cues. So there are a lot of good resources. Tip.
Oh my gosh, I just have to tell you.
Can notice it.
This is so funny to me, because I was talking actually this weekend with my mother-in-law about how I hate shaking hands. It is not because I'm a germaphobe or anything at all. I find it to be an arcane practice that I don't understand. I was telling her that I don't understand why when you meet someone you have to be like, hello, shake a hand. Why you can't just like nod and she
acknowledge.
Yes, and she told me, much like you just said, that you would shake your right hand to show that you didn't have a weapon in your hand. And I didn't know where shaking hands came from. And so that's the same thing. But that is a huge, just one of those little things that you know, it's learning that sets yourself apart and just creates just this little bit of difference. There was another tip that I got at a conference, a speaking conference a couple weeks ago, where the trainer there said to refer to yourself 2 or 3 times as your name in order to have your audience be able to identify themselves having a conversation with you later. So especially if you're looking for referrals or anything like that, you want to make sure that you're like, you know, so I said to myself, Kelly, you know, let's go ahead and do this or whatever. Or I was talking to my client and they said, Kelly, da 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 da, because you want people to imagine themselves having a conversation with you later.
I think that's great. I love that tip.
Yeah. So I love the learning. So Creative Live.
Creative Live is a platform. Okay. Vanessa Van Edwards is the instructor. She's got an amazing website and like so much content. It's overwhelming. But it's so helpful. So one of the things she talks about, they look at how people respond to voice. And so often men in particular, but generally people will respond to a lower voice. So this is advanced and I'm still working on it. But if you can learn to present in the sort of lowest acceptable decibel of speech, you will be more effective, which is really just an interesting, fun thing to toy with. But she talks a lot about how you can pick up a lot from just the audible part of the voice. So even if you're listening to somebody on the phone, there's a lot that we're processing and a lot that's being communicated just through the way your voice sounds. And so keying into that is really useful. She even talked about something funny about how people respond to colors differently, and how, generally speaking, women don't seem to mind purple, but men typically don't like purple. Like, weird stuff that, I mean, whether or not it's applicable or not, it's fun to learn about, and then you pick what's valuable to you. One of my favorite takeaways was not Vanessa, it was another lovely gentleman whose name I cannot recall. But he has a course on there on public speaking, and he talks about starting off every talk with a self-effacing story. So something that's like sort of an embarrassing story about yourself. Yeah. And you can tell almost any story, and then your segue is, the reason I tell you this story is because, and you just find a like cute little one-liner to like, isn't it funny how in life the most unexpected things happen, right? You know, you can tie it into your talk, but the point is, in those first moments, the audience is determining whether or not they like you. Yes. And don't get up there and say, you know, and this is what they tell us in trial work as well. Don't get up there and thank them for their attention. So thank you for inviting me and blah, blah, blah. You're like wasting these few precious moments where you actually have their undivided attention. And so telling them something about yourself that's not a brag, you know, it's like a little bit embarrassing, will endear them to you. People want to root for you as a speaker, and it gives them that opportunity. And so I've played around with it. You know, I've tried out different embarrassing stories. Some of them have been, you know, better than others. But, and I started actually keeping a list in my Evernote, me and my husband, who does a lot of speaking as well. We keep a list of good stories for talks, like just generally like, oh, that's an amazing insight or story to tell, and then also good embarrassing stories about ourselves that we might be able to use in the future. Yeah, because it's just a great way to kick off. And of course, you want your whole talk to be a story, like your whole presentation, regardless of whether or not you're doing blood testing in Wyoming or, you know, any other kind of presentation. Your presentation should be a series of stories. It should never just be facts, because you know, nobody's going to listen unless you're telling a story. Our human brains are made to receive information via stories. If you're not telling a story, then nobody is listening to what you're saying.
Too true. That's a really good point about how our brains work to receive information. I wanted to circle back to what you said about watching yourself on video, because I know that is a tough thing for some people to hear. And I know Nicole Aboud has talked about this a bit too, of like watching your videos and how hard that can be. And I'm weird. It doesn't bother me but that's probably just because I've been doing podcasting for quite a long time, had a podcast separately before this. And so I have heard my voice enough times, but how long did it take you to get used to watching yourself and not wanting to curl up in a ball?
Yeah, you know, I don't know that ever goes away entirely. You know, you have to. Part of that, though, is you don't always need to be your own meanest critic. So part of this is an act of kindness, that you have to agree and promise yourself that you will be kind to yourself, that all those things that you're picking up on, nobody else probably really realized. I will say I also had to give myself the same self-talk that I give my clients, who are often videotaped at their worst possible moment during a DUI investigation on the side of the road. And then that gets broadcast in open court with like a huge audience, you know, on a big screen. And so I always would have to remind myself, you know, if your clients can sit through this horrible experience with, you know, just an amazingly vulnerable position on video in a huge screen in a courtroom, then, you know, I can privately watch myself and get through it. But you get better at it. You will develop a tough skin, and you get better, and your speaking will get better. And that's exciting, because if you see those videos getting progressively better, well, then you will no longer be reluctant to watch yourself.
Absolutely. I love that. I think that's perfect. I have one other, it's sort of a bone to pick with lawyers in general. And so I'm just going to throw this out there and ask you about this. One thing I've noticed, and you are a lawyer, so you will, I know you don't believe in this, but you will fit into this, is lawyers I have found typically, not all, but typically would like to hear from other lawyers, full stop. What do you have insight on that? What is there validity to it? Do you think that viewpoint should be expanded? All of the above.
So that's a good question. I challenge the assumption that lawyers believe that. I will tell you that mostly the people I hear ask me about that or say that are people who are not lawyers, who assume that what we're thinking about is your education. Because anybody who is a lawyer knows that there's nothing magical about the difference between me and somebody who didn't spend 3 years learning something that's completely unrelated to my practice of law, right? Like, we just did the time, but there was nothing magical. There was no secret potion that we got that made us more smart or interesting. And in fact, probably the reverse. And I think what happens in a lot of those contexts is there's either that assumption, you know, some people were like, oh, well, I was talking to a legal tech company and they were like, well, it's important that we hire a lawyer to come around and talk about this product because lawyers want to hear from a lawyer. I was like, no lawyer wants to hear from another lawyer who's not practicing about, right? Like, because they didn't figure out the lawyering part well enough to be good at it so that they're making the money as a lawyer. So I don't know that that is as true as non-lawyers sort of think about. But I have a friend who is wildly successful. He's one of my most successful friends. He did not go to college, and he is out earning all of us, you know, who went to law school. And he's always comes back to this notion of like, well, you know, I may not be the smartest. It's like, you are the smartest on some level because you figured out what we hadn't figured out. And you started a business in your 20s and it's doing amazingly well. And I always tell him, you're the only person in the room who's thinking about your degree. Nobody else is thinking about the fact that you didn't go to college and therefore what you have to say is not valuable. So I think the legal profession in general would benefit from making more space and also encouraging those voices who are of people who are non-lawyers. Because I will tell you, after working in a bunch of small law firms, I will listen to the paralegal who's running a tight ship in a law firm far more readily than I will listen to the lawyer who's like, oh, I'm so great. I've hired these great people to make all these smart decisions. So I love to see non-lawyers on the stage. I don't know that it's lawyers who want to hear from lawyers. And I would love to debunk this myth because I want the more voices on stage, the better.
Well, I think it comes from CLE organizations, and there are quite a few legal organizations where they only allow lawyers to speak. And obviously, I am a non-lawyer, and so that's why I'm curious about where this comes from. But I think it is interesting, just because I have. I like that you brought up, you know, well, maybe I don't want to hear from a lawyer who is, someone who used to be a lawyer or went to law school but couldn't make it work and is now doing this other thing. Not that there's anything wrong with giving up on your law practice if you decide that it is not a fit for you in the long term. Career change is awesome. But it's more just the idea that it's great to learn from the expert in whatever area that person is an expert in.
Right. That's exactly right. And so, for instance, my good friend Ben Sessions in Atlanta, he was chasing Guy all over the country from AttorneySync, who was giving a presentation in Nashville. And Guy happens to be a lawyer, but I promise you that in no way, shape, or form is the value that he delivers to Ben have anything to do with the fact that he has a legal degree, nor did Ben ever think, I'm only going to Nashville because Guy is a lawyer. That is completely secondary. So I would push back on those organizations that prohibit non-lawyers from speaking. I think, you know, there's this other trend that I see in the community where there's a lot of legal events that they don't want to pay speakers. And what they tell lawyers is, well, this is an honor for you to be asked, and this is great marketing for you. And well, both of those things could be true. This is content that you're charging people for and not paying anything for the content. And so I think that has really diluted the value of CLEs by having free content, by putting these artificial restrictions like it can only be a lawyer who talks. And it's like, well, a lawyer doesn't often have time or the interest to develop a specialty in speaking and teaching and being valuable to the people who are coming. Whereas non-lawyers can be just unbelievably helpful and powerful. And so to limit, so I think that comes from two places, that assumption that lawyers are going to be more valuable in some way, shape, or form. And this idea that you can get a free workforce, you know, to come and deliver content that you're going to charge for because you're telling them it's such an honor to be on the stage when, you know, if you're going to deliver valuable content, it's a lot of work. And if other people are paying for it, then maybe the speakers should also be paid for it. And we can raise the bar across the country on the CLE content that we're delivering.
Yeah, well, because I mean, that the paying for a speaker is a really good point, because if you think about how much a lawyer is charging by hour for their practice, and how much time it takes to put together a presentation, time to go and deliver that presentation, that is hours and hours that you are then not able to bill. So it's like, well, if you're not going to pay me for my time there, and I can take a case and make money there, what am I gonna do? Like
that, yeah, that's right. And that's so fair. I mean, when people say that to me, I think, you know, any given lecture that you see me give, I've put in more than 100 hours on that talk. Like it is a labor of love. It is like a trial prep on steroids. And then if I've been giving it for years, every time I go and revisit it, it's more time I've invested in prepping it. So to suggest that that's just as valuable as somebody who's giving a presentation that they just slapped together. You know, I'll be on stages with people who they're like, oh, I don't even know what I'm going to say. I've got like 10 minutes of content and an hour to fill. It's like that. I think if you have a lot of speakers like that, then there's not much that the lawyers are getting out of that CLE programming, and they're paying money for something just to say that they got the CLE credits, but it's not advancing their career. It's not advancing their practice. And so one of the good things that I'm seeing that I love is places like Clio and legal tech companies coming in, and they're going to fill a vacuum of, if you guys aren't willing, if the state bars aren't willing to pay for content, or the main CLE providers aren't willing to pay for content and bring their A game, well, they now have competition that they've never had for years. Like Chris Video is paying keynote speakers $50,000, you know, or more. I don't know if they are. Sorry, I shouldn't say Chris Video, but given that, you know, they have Gloria Allred and they have Gary Vee. They have amazing people who command very high speaker fees coming, as does Clio. Well, you know, get ready, because they're going to start delivering better content than what we're getting at our CLEs, and clients will go there. So I think it's cool to see this happening, but I also, and I think Georgia State Bar is actually doing a really good job of upping their game, but you know, there's competition here. And so I think it's exciting for people who want to speak and deliver great content, and who want lawyers to have a place to learn and learn great stuff. But it's definitely a disruption that's happening, and it's fun to watch.
Yes, it is. All right. So any last tips that you want to share with our audience about building out your business as a public speaker?
Well, you know, I just want to encourage everybody to do it. You know, you're not going to, you say, well, what's the worst that could happen? And it's scary. I think public speaking is one of the top fears in the US. I don't know who's getting this polling data, but that's what I've heard. And I believe it, because, you know, we all have this worst case scenario. I love the idea that the more you are on stage, the better you will be. Like, no matter what, if you are authentically you, and the way that you get there is just like getting on stage and taking that risk. And you should be proud of yourself for doing it. Like, we've all bombed. You have to bomb. I bombed in court and I bombed on stage. And that's the only way. If you've never bombed, then you will not be good. And that's the only way that you can get good. So you need to applaud yourself, and you need to surround yourself with a tribe of people who will support and encourage you to get up and do it again. Because although that pain, you know, it is scary, you can practice for it. You can be the most prepared person in the room. I practice in front of a mirror. I can't tell you how many hours of presentations I've given to my bathroom mirror. And that was really the thing that always gave me the security blanket to walk in, was that, you know, I have speakers who are like, oh, I haven't actually done a run through. And I'm like, I've done a run through 50 times. Like, when I was new, I did it a ton. If you have that time, you will not embarrass yourself. You will feel better. And it's just such a thrill to be on stage. So, if you think that you're going to enjoy it, do it and take every opportunity, because it's amazing now in my career to be standing in front of a room full of 500 attorneys and my hands are not sweating and they're not shaking and I am cracking my same bad but somewhat corny good jokes and people seem to be responding, right? There's something so exhilarating about being able to be in front of that audience and say what you want to say. So I think that it helps you in all areas of your life. And just a fun thing to work on.
Oh, such great advice. I love it all. Thank you so much for joining me. And to all of our listeners, if they want to get a hold of you, how is it best that they do so?
So you can find me on any social channel, usually at EHG Law Firm. Can I add in one little tip that I want to share?
Yes, one more tip.
Actually, if you've listened all the way through, this is the money shot right here.
All right.
Unsplash.com. That is where you find images for slides. That is like the one tip that's worth your price of admission. Unsplash.com for content, for slides. I know we're rewinding back to one of our first questions, but I wanted to get it in there because it has free images that are beautiful and it's evergreen. They're always being replenished and you can use them for your business, for your website, for your slides. So that is where you get, don't go to stock photography. Don't ruin a presentation with stock photography because it's the worst. Sorry.
Perfect.
Okay. So find me on social, EHG Law Firm. That's where I am. Please follow me. I love getting followers and reach out and say hi.
Awesome. Fabulous. Thank you so much. And all of our listeners, of course, always like, subscribe, leave us a rating on Apple Podcast. And thanks so much for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly.